I'm Dr. Wes Center, and I am the clinic director and owner of Brain Behavior Associates in Fort Worth, Texas. We specialize in psychophysiological interventions for people with behavioral health issues. I got started in this field after I retired from the military. I served in the Marine Corps on active duty for 23 years. I'm a combat veteran of the Gulf War. And what drove me into the behavioral health field was I really wanted to understand why it was that some of my colleagues got PTSD and I didn't, even though we were in the same situation in the military. And so after retirement, I used my VA money to go get a couple of master's degrees and a PhD in psychology to try to understand what's going on with trauma. And I discovered very quickly after working in psych hospitals for about 5 years that we really don't understand trauma very well, nor do we understand many of the other behavioral health issues, whether it's anxiety, depression, PTSD, all the alphabet soup of ADHD, ODD, OCD. We really don't understand them from a root cause perspective. And so I was in conversation with a psychiatrist that I work with who encouraged me to read the writings of Dr. Daniel Amen. And he had written a book called Change Your Brain, Change Your Life. The book was published in like 1999, 1998. And as I was reading through the book, there was one sentence that just kind of set a hook in me. And it was, why are psychiatrists the only physicians in all of medicine that don't image the organ that they work with? And I read that several times. I said, yeah, that doesn't make sense to me. Why is it that they don't do that? And again, it wasn't really a knock against psychiatrists so much as it was, we have these tools to be able to investigate what's going on in a person's brain. Why don't we use them? And so Dr. Amen had gotten his start before he went into SPECT imaging in neurofeedback. And so since I'd been trained as a psychologist, I wanted to learn how to use EEG biofeedback, neurofeedback, and then peripheral measures of biofeedback, which led me into then doing some additional training for QEEG, which is a form of neuroimaging that looks at brain electrical activity and kind of maps what's going on in the brain to functional deficits, whether it be executive function, mood, other forms of function, and then to be able to figure out how best to address them. That got me into frequency-based interventions. So not just with neurofeedback, but also audiovisual entrainment. And so I started studying what was available in the world from audiovisual entrainment, which I went down the rabbit hole then of looking at Royal Rife's work and then Hulda Clark's work with frequency-based interventions. And so as I began to emerge in my own clinical practice to bringing these different things to bear on our patients, we started to use the EEG and neuropsychological measures to assess them. And then we would pick our interventions, how we would address them using those same neuroelectrical, bioelectrical rhythms. And then we would use those as the way to reassess them throughout treatment. So we developed this program called Assess, Address, Reassess, using psychophysiological measures, biofeedback, neurofeedback, quantitative EEG. Then later we started to get involved in neurotransmitter stress hormone testing, functional genetics testing, so that we could more narrowly, nail down what the best intervention was for a given patient. And so that was driving us in the direction of personalized medicine. But kind of layered over all that was, how do we find the best intervention the quickest and to give the most immediate results? So neurofeedback's really good if you've got 3 to 6 months to work with someone. But if you've got somebody that's in crisis and they need to be addressed today, audiovisual entrainment, particularly the immersive forms of audiovisual entrainment like you can get with the AO Scan and the Hub, were game changers because we were able to take somebody who was in a panic attack and then do a very quick voice print analysis on them, find out those stress points, feed it back to them through audiovisual entrainment, cranial electric stimulation, and then later microtesla. So just layering these interventions on and immediately be able to get to the person's presenting issue in such a way that they got immediate relief. Now, we still did neurofeedback with them, but that was a more longer term, taking advantage of long-term potentiation of the brain to create new networks, new functional pathways, to dehabituate old pathways associated with behaviors that we wanted to wire out. But it's the synergistic effect of being able to do audiovisual entrainment in an immersive way that allowed us to be able to get somebody into longer-term neurofeedback. We started using pulse electromagnetic field therapies, PEMF, and other interventions that we could layer together with that to kind of 10x what we were seeing from our patients. So I think the cool thing about AO Scan, for example, is that it's scalable, so you can do just the voice interventions and feed them back auditorially through an app on the phone and headphones, or you can do it in clinic where you're doing the visual entrainment, the audio entrainment, and the cranial electric stimulation applied to the earlobes so that you are getting a more synergistic effect. And again, it follows the principle that most of us in the brain space know, that what the brain can't anticipate, it can't ignore. And so this method of intervention prevents the brain from being able to anticipate what's coming next because the feedback is always changing. And so you get a more immediate entrainment effect. It's kind of like having a bunch of train cars that are stuck on the track with no way to move, and then you back up a powerful locomotive to it, and you start pulling it in the direction of health down that train track. That's essentially what immersive audio entrainment with cranial electric stimulation does for you. It helps the brain to re-trigger these very minute neuronal action potentials that allow the brain to be able to change in real time. And so, again, I think the best use of these technologies are stacked together, but then you can also use them as standalone treatments to be done at home. And again, it's very much patient-centered. You're not prescribing the same intervention for every patient. When we do the assessment, we're having the person feed into the AO scanner system the frequencies of their voice, and it's doing a voice print analysis, and then it feeds back to the brain through audio, visual, cranial electric stimulation, the frequencies that the brain needs to be able to pace down. So it's built on this principle that the brain knows what it needs, even though it doesn't use words to express it. But it does use vocal patterns, or it uses brain electrical patterns, and very complicated brain electrical patterns to be able to communicate, this is what's wrong with me. And it doesn't really say this is what's wrong as much as it says, this is what I need. So for example, when you feed white light to the brain will produce both patterns and it will produce colors from the white light. As you all know, white light is composed of the entirety of the color spectrum. Black is the absence of any of that. And so when you feed white light, the brain will process it as a color. We know this from things like Irlen syndrome, where a person has a TBI and a very specific notch of the color spectrum will get knocked out, such that when they try to read black print on a white background, the letters may appear to move or wiggle or shake or rise up off the page. This is known as scotopic sensitivity syndrome. That happens because there's a frequency within the light spectrum that the brain can't process anymore, or struggles to process, particularly when they get tired. And so essentially what we're doing with voice print technology is we're using the voice to out what that frequency is that the brain needs. And then through the AO Scanner software processing system, it's extracting that on the high and low side, and then feeding that back in the entrainment, both auditorially and visually, and again, cranial electric stimulation, to be able to give the brain what it wants or what it needs in order to self-soothe. All the technologies that we're talking about, whether it's audiovisual entrainment, neurofeedback, biofeedback, are all oriented toward health via self-regulation. So we're doing the assess using the voice print or QEEG or whatever particular biorhythm that we're focused on. And then we use the intervention to address it based on that assessment. And then later, we're going to reassess to see the effect that our intervention had. And the beauty of the AO scanner is that you can do both the assess, address, and reassess all with the same instrument. And so it's a game changer in that regard, because you're not having to use different technologies to assess what you're going to do to intervene, and then a different technology to do the intervention, and then yet another technology to do the reassessment. I think it's helpful to have other things like self-report instruments, PHQ-9, Patient Health Questionnaire, Pittsburgh Sleep Quality Index, which is one of my personal favorites. I think everybody coming into any clinic should be assessed for sleep, because so many of the behavioral health problems that people experience and physical health problems are directly connected to quality of sleep, sleep duration, sleep onset. And so the Pittsburgh Sleep Quality Index, which is in the public domain, allows you to get a really good handle on where your patients are in terms of sleep. And of course, you're all going to do your assessments of diet and exercise to see what are they putting into their body, and then what are they doing to burn things off of their body. But the AO scan, again, is probably without peer in terms of stress response, in terms of assessment, direct intervention, and treatment. All the universe actually exists as energy. So the universe is composed of two things, time and energy. And all energy exists in waves. So anything that is an energy system, we can measure in terms of its waves. And most waves, or if not all of them, we measure in terms of frequency. That is, how frequently does it wave? So, for example, a 1 hertz wave will resolve, so wave one time in a 1 second interval. We call those epochs, or the Brits call them epochs. So in 1 second, that's a 1 hertz wave. If it does it twice in a second, it's 2 hertz, and so forth and so on. Each of these frequencies that we can measure are also associated with brain states. So for example, when you're asleep, you are moving in and out of delta, which is around 0.5 hertz to 4 hertz. When we're daydreaming, or when we are doing background memory scanning, like when you're trying to remember that person's name, you see their face, but you're trying to remember their name, that we go into theta for that. When we're in alpha, we're not working, but we're prepared to work. So we're relaxed, we're attentive, but we're not actually doing anything. Then from about 12 to 15 hertz, what we call beta 1 or low beta, we are in our focused attention. So you're in beta 1 when you're reading, when you're conversing, you're involved in a conversation and dialogue with somebody, you're thinking about what's being said or what you're going to say. Then we're in about 12 to 15 hertz. The middle of that range at 14 hertz has this very special name. It's called the Tansey rhythm. And that's what was given to people who had seizure disorders, which happened down in the theta range. We give them 14 hertz to insulate them against that kindling of seizures. And so there's actually a relationship of some of the frequencies to other frequencies, and we can use them to either increase or decrease a target behavior that we want to encourage or to discourage. So generally nothing really good happens above about 18 hertz. It's associated with anxiety. It can be associated with trauma, particularly long-term trauma, complex trauma, developmental trauma, until we get around 40 hertz. So from about 40 to 40 hertz, 44 hertz, we get what's called the shear rhythm, or the binding frequency. And we've all experienced that, that aha moment, or that eureka moment. Eureka is the Greek that means I found it. And so when we find something that we've been able to put a couple of things together and then make something new out of that, that eureka moment occurs. Well, our brains are operating at about 40 to 44 hertz when that happens. And so we actually like to give 40 hertz or 44 hertz neurofeedback or stimulation therapy or audiovisual entrainment, because it helps us to have those aha moments. It actually encourages our brain to do complex processing. So what do we use things like the AO Hub for? So we use it to be able to reflect back to the brain through entrainment the specific frequency that we want it to engage in. So for example, if somebody was having problems with being relaxed and focused, so maybe they were terribly inattentive, too much theta, or they were anxious and unable to relax, too much 18 to 25 hertz activity, then we would want to give them 10 hertz and train them to 10 hertz, which would induce calm. It's a calming frequency. And so we call those frequency-specific interventions. So those are based on, again, our just general knowledge of how the human brain works and knowing that these specific frequencies tend to dominate whenever we're in these specific states. You'll also hear people call it state training, trying to induce a psychophysiological state. So for example, the inattentive form of ADHD is able to be seen very easily in a quantitative brain map by looking for excess 4 to 8 hertz activity somewhere along the center strip of the brain called the cingulate cortex. And that's the brain's gear shifter. It's what gets us into different states of arousal. So if you're sitting on the couch watching TV, that's an under-aroused state. But when mom calls you to come to the dinner table, you have to change into a state of arousal that gets you disengaged from the television, up and move into the dinner table. That requires a state change. Well, if you're stuck in theta, you don't do those changes very well. And you can see that it's in children as young as, first, second grade, when they have trouble transitioning between things in the classroom. So like when they go from reading to math or math to social sciences, and they struggle to make those transitions, that's almost always an excess of frontal theta, for example. People who are anxious will show an excess of fast activity frontally and sometimes in the temporal lobes. People who have unstable moods, so they cycle in and out of being happy and sad very quickly, they generally have too much alpha activity in their temporal lobes. So it's not just what, it's also where the activity is occurring that helps us understand what's going on in that person's brain. So through using the hub, we're able to, again, do a quick assessment, see where the stress is and how it's impacting that person. Could be in focus, could be in attention, which are not the same thing. It could be on decision-making, planning, and control. That's all frontal lobes. It could be auditory processing. That's all temporal lobes. Could be sensory integration and processing. That's the parietal lobes. Could be visual processing. That's the occipital lobes. And all of these parts of the brain work together to do what they do. So although vision is largely done in the occipital lobe, the frontal lobe plays a role too. And even though auditory processing is largely in the temporal lobes, the frontal lobes and the parietal lobes play a role in auditory processing as well. So it's what we call hub and spoke. So the parietal lobe is the hub for sensory integration and processing, but it gets visual data from the occipital lobe. It gives auditory data from the temporal lobes. It gives tactile data from the central motor strip. And so each of those parts of the brain do a certain task as a hub, but they also engage other parts of the brain to do other work. So let's say we have a kid who has ADHD and they have sensory issues. Well, we're going to look in the back, in the parietal lobe, which does sensory integration and processing, to see if there's too much fast activity back there. Because if it is, that may make that child hypersensitive to textures. For example, some of those kiddos really can't stand those scratchy tags in the back of their shirts because it touches them. Or they may not like the texture of bananas or avocados because it feels too slimy to them. That's a sensory integration and processing issue. So if we know that they're producing too much energy, and again, we're doing that scan to figure out where that excess activity is, and it's almost always an excess. Very rarely is a deficit of activity, but mostly always an excess. Then we're going to use the scanner to feed back the frequency that serves as a corrective to that excess. So again, maybe they're doing 18 to 20 hertz back here, and it's picked up through the voice print as excess activity that shows as vocal stress. then we feed back a lower component to be able to get that to calm down. And so again, understanding that certain parts of the brain do certain things and certain frequencies are evidence of certain types of activity, we can use the hub to be able to help us to assess where we've got too much activity or, again, occasionally too little. Feed back to the brain the frequency that's going to help it to dampen that excess or to give it a little bit more oomph and that frequency spectrum where it needs the help. And then that becomes the addressing that we're doing. And then after we've delivered the intervention, we can assess again to see, did we have a positive outcome on that variable of interest that we were trying to move with the scanner? And again, because of the way that the software and the hardware are integrated, we're able to do an immersive experience with visual entrainment, auditory entrainment, cranial electric stimulation to be able to induce the state that we're wanting to, again, based on our assessment. And again, that's the beauty of the way that Hub works. It works in an integrative fashion to bring on different modes of intervention, bring it on a visual mode, an auditory mode, a cranial electric stimulation mode, and a change in the electromagnetic field of the head to induce changes brought about by what our assessment said that our subject or our evaluee needs. And then after the treatment is delivered, we could reassess immediately, although you're likely to have those immediate effects show up. I would recommend that if you're going to do it, the soonest you reevaluate would be the next day, and even more preferably, deliver it every day for a week, and then at the end of the week, then do your reassessment, because it's a better indication of how far you've moved than just doing a daily assessment. But I think either would work. I just, in our clinical practice, that tends to be the way we do it, because we want to see the aggregate of those moves over time rather than a bunch of quick snapshots in a row. And sometimes the brain's a little stubborn, particularly with a deeply entrained kinds of patterns of behavior. So for example, I talked about the excess of theta in the inattentive form of ADHD, which by the way is largely in our girls. So it's mainly a feature of inattentive form of ADHD in around 5 to 7-year-old to about 16-year-old females. Somewhere around 16, a lot of that tends to go away, but it doesn't all go away. But it's almost always a result of excess theta frontally. And then you get those symptoms of daydreaming, can't pay attention, can't follow steps in a process. Will only catch the first 2 or 3 steps and directions that are given to them, or maybe only the middle 2. So they're late getting to the party to pay attention, and then they leave the party early, so they only get steps 3 and 4, but they're missing 1 and 2 and 5 and 6. And so that's almost always the result of excess theta activity frontally. So after doing the scan, what we would find is that we would have some immediate effects, but then maybe 12 to 24 hours later, the brain might go back to that theta state that it's used to, meaning that we would need to do multiple interventions over a period of time to see a gradual reduction and over time elimination of the theta activity, or that brain kind of stuck in oatmeal kind of feeling that gave rise to the inattention. So we want to use the device, and again, the device would enable you to go after multiple issues at the same time. And again, I think particularly if you're thinking about this clinically, you would want to pick the thing that would give the person the biggest improvement in their quality of life today. So, and I frequently ask that question: what's the one thing that you walked in here today with that if you left my office and you weren't carrying that anymore would be of best benefit to you? And so for many of our kiddos, it says, I just wish that I could pay attention, particularly in the classroom or when somebody's talking to me, a low stimulus environment. And so that would be the one thing that I would work on. And again, the hub will allow you to work on, dozens of things at the same time. I think that in order to have the person to be most aware of the changes that are coming, that you pick out the one or maybe two things that are most important. Now, I'll say this. If sleep is a problem at all, it's the first thing that should be addressed in your training. You should go after sleep first, because everything gets better with sleep. Your mood improves with sleep. Your energy improves with sleep. Your focus attention improves with sleep. Your memory improves with sleep. Symptoms related to PTSD improve with sleep. So if we can improve sleep onset, sleep quality, and sleep duration, you will get improvements in everything else. So there's bleed over effects from sleep. So fortunately, one of the things the Hub is really good at is getting at sleep through, again, audiovisual entrainment with cranial electric stimulation. And there is a ton of research that's out there on audiovisual entrainment and cranial electric stimulation. Some of the best has been done in Canada by a researcher by the name of Dave Seaver. And Dave has published for the last 20, 30 years on audiovisual entrainment. And a lot of what the Hub technology is built off of is that early work done by Seaver and others to show that frequency-specific interventions using multiple modalities of audio entrainment, visual entrainment, cranial electric stimulation, and now microtesla are just game changers in getting the brain to adopt new ways of behaving. So I would strongly encourage that if you're going to use the Hub, that the first thing you assess is a person's sleep, and then intervene. And almost always, they'll tell you that something is shifted in their sleep, and it's usually something you don't expect, like, hey, I just noticed I'm dreaming in color again, and I can't tell you the last time I dreamed in color. That's a really common experience with audiovisual entrainment. Another is I woke up rested. I can't remember the last time I woke up rested. And I didn't get any longer sleep than I normally get. I get about 7.5 hours. I got 7.5 hours last night. But I woke up. I woke up without the alarm. I felt ready to get up and go. And so if you can have a measurable change in sleep, you'll improve everything in that person's life. And then the other changes will tend to happen more quickly when sleep has been resolved. The other thing is that they will trust you in the interventions that you're recommending, because you've had a significant improvement in an area of life that's critical to everybody. And I don't know there's anything more critical than being able to sleep. We need to understand sleep as a transition in a state of arousal from being awake to the state of drowsiness to then the state of sleep. We track that state by change in frequency. So when we're awake, we're in that 10 to 12 to 15 hertz activity range. We're doing things, we're thinking, we're idling. 10 hertz is our idle speed. But eventually, we want to slow down and get ready to go to sleep. And so we need to transition from that faster frequency state into a lower state of arousal so that we're asleep. And each of those transitions is marked by a change in dominant frequency. So we go from being beta alpha dominant to theta dominant. And then when we're asleep, we're delta dominant. And so we want that to be a smooth and an orderly transition. We don't want it to be jerky, because when we get jerky, we tend to get back up into the higher states. So we want a nice, smooth, gentle drop off. But there are things that we do that self-sabotage that all the time. We get on our cell phones, which gives us blue light right here in our face, which interferes with the circadian hormone melatonin. So the reason why our bodies make melatonin out of serotonin, by the way, that's where melatonin comes from, is from serotonin, is because the light particles that are in the environment around 3 in the afternoon start to decrease. And there's a little bitty structure in the brain called the suprachiasmatic nucleus that senses that decrease in photons and tells the pineal gland, hey, it's time to start making melatonin. But when you put white light in your face, it interferes with that suprachiasmatic nucleus's activity. And it says, no, just kidding, sun's really not going down. We got more white light coming. So we can interfere with our sleep by having cell phones and smart devices in our bedrooms. You should never use your cell phone as your alarm clock. Go to Walmart and Target and get yourself a $10 alarm clock, but don't use your cell phone for that, because for you to use it, it has to be close to you and it has to be turned on. And when it's on and close to you, it's a radio. It's emitting EMF. So get it out of your bedroom. In our house, they're parked in the living room. So nobody's cell phones after 9 o'clock are in front of their face. They're plugged in on a stand and they're not retrieved until the next morning. And so some of you are going to go through cell phone withdrawal, but you need to do that because it need to decrease that EMF that you're bombarding your noggin with. It also is good if you don't have the electrical meter on your house on the same wall as a bedroom. You want to make sure that you're away from that, because those are EMF meters. They're emitting EMF constantly, and so you need to be shielded from that some. You can use RF shielding if you want to, but what we're trying to do is to distinguish the noisy EMF that's harmful from those frequencies that are beneficial to us. And again, your brain produces electromagnetic fields. That's how we can read EEG. The EEG that's coming off your skull is the result of the metabolic and neuroelectrical activity, neurochemical activity of the neurons in the brain. So your brain actually makes about a picowatt of energy every day. And so it produces electrical activity sufficient that we can read it using passive sensors on the skull. So it's not that all EMF is bad. It's just that some EMF is pro-inflammatory, like your cell phone towers, and some of our televisions and other electronic devices, because they emit the wrong frequencies of energy, and some energy is helpful. So all of us have listened to classical or soothing music and felt that music kind of penetrate and vibrate our chest cavities so that we feel the music. Those are beneficial frequencies. And we've done tons of study on classical music and the soothing effect that it has on the brain, but it also has a soothing effect on the vagus nerve. And the vagus nerve is what moderates our diaphragmatic breathing, our heart rate and heart rate variability, and all those things related with the peripheral nervous system and the autonomic nervous system. And so we know that just from listening to classical music and the frequencies that our body absorbs when we listen to that it's very calming, because again, it's causing a relaxation response in both the vagus nerve and the central motor area. So these are healthy frequencies as distinguished from those that are not healthy. And again, all this makes sense. The entirety of our universe exists as energy and in time, and all energy exists in waves or frequencies that we can measure. And again, our body does as well. I mean, the whole idea that we are fearfully and wonderfully made comes from these very complex things, that many of which we're just beginning to understand, particularly about how the brain works and interacts with the second brain, the gut, and how that information exchange between the two can become pro-inflammatory. And then what do we need to do to reduce inflammation? We know we have 9 times as many pathways coming up from the gut as we have going down from the brain to the gut. And so many times, in order to have a positive effect on neurocognition and our behavioral health, we have to intervene at the level of our gut, whether it's to straighten out the microbiome or to reduce leaky gut. We have to do some gut-borne interventions. But as our focus here is on the head, what frequencies can we use to induce or impart, or as I've said earlier, entrain the brain to adopt a new way of behaving so that we get the companion state change benefits from that? So again, using the example of the child who can't pay attention because they've got so much theta activity going on, if we give them that 12 to 15 hertz activity, we can induce relaxed focus such that it overcomes that excess theta. So generally that happens as a result of doubling or halving the frequency that's the problem. So for example, if 7 hertz is the problem, we'll give 14 hertz to both decrease the brain producing 7 hertz and also increasing 14 hertz. That compensatory frequency tends to induce a positive state change. If we want to make it easier for you to go to sleep, for example, we'll want to help that transition from a dominant 10 hertz down through the frequency range of theta so that it can drift down into delta on its own. So many times when we're thinking too much, we got too much activity, we call it chatty brain going on in the back of the head, too much beta activity posteriorly, the brain has a difficulty relaxing enough to be able to go to sleep. The cortex goes to sleep from the outside in. The frontal lobes, the temporal lobes, the occipital and parietal lobes go to sleep from the outside in. The last thing to go to sleep is the central motor strip. And that's why we get that sleep paralysis that we've all experienced, where we've had the dream and we can't move, we can't say anything, and our bed partner's elbowing us because we're making all kinds of noise. That's sleep paralysis. And that happens when the motor strip goes to sleep. So if we're wanting to induce a healthy drop off to sleep, we have to make those transitions smooth from a higher state of arousal to a lower state of arousal. So again, those states of arousal occur with those different frequency sets. And so low arousal, delta theta, inward locus of control, inward focus. 8 to 12 hertz, that's a moderately internal focus and a moderately external focus. It's very balanced. We're not doing anything, but we're alert, relaxed, attentive, waiting to do something. Then in the 12 to 15 hertz, we are moderately aroused and with a moderate level of external locus of control. The faster we get up into the frequencies until we hit gamma around 40 hertz, we tend to give away our locus of control and we tend to be hyper-focused externally. That tends to be our anxiety, our trauma, our hyper-focused ADHD, our hyperactive ADHD. Those are up there in those faster frequencies. And so what we're using the hub to do is to use that voice print to give an indication of where we are in our stress response. So again, I want us to think of stress as neither positive nor negative. It's just a thing. So if you weren't stressed, you wouldn't be able to take your foot off the accelerator and cover the brake when all the taillights in front of you turn red. So you wouldn't be prepared to stop if you didn't have appropriate levels of stress. It's the same thing for studying for an exam, or as we're all doing right now, gathering receipts and things to prepare to submit your taxes to the IRS. You know, it's stress that allows you to do that. There's good stress, eustress, and bad stress, malstress. So what we want to do with our vocal print is to determine what stress inflections are being carried in the voice. Are they eustress or are they malstress? Are they bad stress? And so those voice prints will line up directly with those states of arousal that we're in. Externally aroused, external focused, or low state of arousal, internal focused. And those are very important in order to determine what the correct intervention is in terms of audio, visual, cranial electric stimulation. What we're doing with the immersive aspect is we're giving the brain so much information, it can't ignore it, and it just accepts it. It just, okay, you're overwhelming with all this information that you're giving me, with all this frequency-based audio, visual, cranial electric, micro. I'm just gonna surrender to that, and then I'm gonna follow as you're leading. So many of you will be familiar with race cars, like NASCAR. And at the very beginning of the race, there's a car that gets out on the track that's called the pace car. And all of the field will follow the pace car until the pace car gets the field up to speed. And then the pace car will leave the track, and then the race begins. That's essentially what entrainment does. We use the intervention of the hub through visual, auditory, cranial electric stimulation, and the micro Tesla stem to be able to pace the brain to a frequency, and we just keep pacing, keep pacing, keep pacing, keep pacing. And at the end of the intervention, the reason the person feels better is because the brain has adopted that pacing strategy from frequency-based intervention to be able to then continue it. And again, initially in those first few sessions, it may not last for very long, 6, 12, 8, hours, something like that. More unusually, but not all that uncommon, 24 hours later, they still feel the effects of the entrainment, but eventually it wears off. That's why we do that every day, try to aim for the same time of day, and then, track those over time. And then after some period of time, the brain will then hold that as its new way of doing business. So entrainment works best when it's every day, generally the same time every day, and over an extended period of time. In our clinic, we do it anywhere from 20 to 40 sessions, usually more toward 40. Before then, we send people with a home-based intervention. So in clinic, 20 to 40 sessions, and then we're seeing consistent scan, rescan results. Then we know they're ready to move on and to do the intervention at home. But again, we start with sleep. Good sleep hygiene is critical. Not exercising too late in the day. Don't eat too late in the day. For children in particular, they need to have their meals done by 6:30. Otherwise their body is not resting. It's still digesting when we try to put them to sleep. And again, kiddos' sleep cycle. Believe it or not, a teenager needs between 8 and 11 hours of sleep, and most of them are getting 6 to 8. And many of those kiddos are doing much more poorly academically than they otherwise would because they're not getting restful sleep. And many of them, if you'll go into their cell phone records and look at their text, you'll see a lot of your kiddos are sneaking their cell phones in and they're texting at 2 and 3 in the morning. And it's just extremely deleterious to their sleep. So good sleep hygiene, diet, sleep, and exercise, locking cell phones down for kids and adults somewhere in that last 40 minutes to an hour before bedtime is absolutely critical so that we're not overstimulating at a time the brain is trying to transition down into sleep. So as a clinician, the thing that excites me the most about having the AO Hub in my practice is what I used to do was do bits and pieces of audio entrainment or visual entrainment or cranial electric stimulation. And I only had one technology that allowed me to do those three together, but I didn't have any that also allowed me to add micro Tesla onto it. That it would just kind of have to be piecemealed in a very awkward way that didn't work together, that didn't use the same software platform. And frankly, it was a discouragement to try to use it because it just wasn't an all-in-one kind of solution. And the thing that the AO Hub allows me to do is to assess, address, and reassess on one platform. It allows me to give a totally immersive experience with audiovisual entrainment, with cranial electric stimulation, and micro Tesla, so that I can bring all those four modalities to bear in one session without having to switch wires, cables, software, and it's much more convenient for the client. So it's got good portability. I can move it around the office if I need to. It's got great facility to the client. They do not feel like they're being overwhelmed with too many things on them. I can control the amount of stimulation very easily. I just use slider bars so that if they're saying, hey, the audio is perfect, but the visual's just a little bit too much, or hey, I don't feel anything on my ears, I'm able to adjust all of those inputs on the fly and to give a totally immersive experience in a way that none of the other technologies that I have allow me to do. I have over $500,000 worth of technology in the clinic between biofeedback, neurofeedback, QEEG, audio-visual entrainment from other units. But that AO Hub allows me to do it a cost-effective way that's a great facility portability and availability to my client, and allows me to move it around the office that the other things that I have just don't allow me to do. And so it's becoming a force multiplier for what we're doing in behavioral health, because we can also combine it with other interventions before or after their session. So with our talk therapists, we're able to do the AO Hub intervention in the hour before they go in for their talk therapy. And our talk therapists are telling us that they're coming in more ready to engage in the therapy, that they're getting down to the root causes of their issues from a psychosocial perspective, such that it's actually helping us to get better outcomes in talk therapy, which isn't something that we were looking to do. We were just looking to make the client more comfortable before they engaged in their trauma group or in their talk therapy. And that we found that it's actually helping to make talk therapy go more quickly and to get better gains in treatment. So that was one of those unintended things that occurred as a result of layering it with the other things that we do. But we intend to use biofeedback and neurofeedback along with the AO Hub so that we have a more immersive experience, but also are able to measure more discreetly what's going on in the body using these other technologies. So I'm excited to have it, and I feel pretty certain you will too.